On Sunday, November 18th, 2001, four spelunkers entered a small limestone cave in the foothills of the Austrian Alps. The entrance was hidden in a wooded slope. It was only a low crack between wet rock, fallen leaves, and exposed roots. The group had been inside before, but this time they had returned for a narrow passage discovered on an earlier trip. The most interested in it was Danny Derber. Danny was 34 years old and experienced underground. He knew how to move through tight crawls and control his breathing, but the new passage had stayed in his mind for weeks because air moved through it. In caves, a draft can mean more passage beyond. On the previous trip, Danny had pushed one arm and shoulder into the restriction, felt space beyond it, and turned back. He believed the tight part was short. That belief brought him back. For the first hour, nothing went wrong. The group moved through the entrance crawl, crossed a shallow stream passage, climbed over broken limestone, and reached the muddy section near the unexplored slot. The slot angled downward like a tilted letterbox cut into the rock. A person had to enter on their side, with one arm stretched forward and the other pinned back. Past the first few feet, it appeared to widen before bending out of sight. Danny removed his pack and clipped it behind him. Then he turned sideways and entered. At first, he moved steadily. His helmet scraped the upper wall, his chest pressed against the lower wall. He exhaled, pushed with his toes, shifted his hips, and slid deeper into the slot. The others watched his boots disappear inch by inch, then his hips passed the inner lip. At that point, the passage changed. Beyond the visible slot, the floor dropped into a sloping trench hidden under wet clay. Danny's upper body slid forward and down, but his hips and thighs stayed higher in the passage. In one sudden movement, his body folded across two different angles of rock. His shoulders and chest were now lower than his legs. He was not fully upside down, but the angle was steep enough for pressure to build in his head and face. His right arm was stretched forward into the lower trench. His left arm was trapped along his side. His knees remained behind him in the upper slot. Danny tried to back out. That was when he understood the problem. The passage had acted like a one-way gate. Going forward, gravity had helped him slide into the clay. Coming backward was different. His hips lifted into a hidden rock lip above him. The more he pushed back, the more his pelvis locked against the ceiling. He could not lower his hips. He could not lift his chest. He could not turn around. No rock had fallen on him. No boulder had pinned his legs. He was trapped by the shape of the cave. At first, the others thought he had only paused to adjust. Then they heard his breathing change. It became heavy and controlled, the breathing of someone trying not to panic. One member reached his boots and pulled gently while Danny pushed backward. Nothing happened. They tried again while Danny exhaled. His body shifted less than an inch, then stopped hard against the rock. They removed his boots, loosened his belt, unclipped his pack line, and tried rotating his legs. But the angle would not change. Danny's lower body was in one passage. His upper body was in another. The bend between them had become a hinge that would not open. Then water began moving through the clay. It was not a flood. It was a thin trickle passing beneath Danny's chest and disappearing into the lower trench. At first, the others thought the mud might help him slide, but the opposite happened. Each time Danny struggled, his chest pressed deeper into the clay. Each time he exhaled, his ribs became smaller and the mud accepted him farther. Each time he inhaled, the rock above him stopped his chest from expanding fully. The cave had created a rhythm. Exhale, sink lower. Inhale, fight the ceiling. After several failed attempts, one member crawled out to raise the alarm. By the time Austrian cave rescue specialists entered, Danny had been trapped for hours. Rescuers could reach his legs and part of his hips, but not his chest, shoulders, or trapped arm. The lower trench was beyond the slot, and there was no room for anyone to pass beside him. That was the worst part. Danny was close enough to touch, close enough to speak to, but the part of him that needed to be freed was out of reach. The rescuers tried a controlled pull first. They padded a rope around Danny's hips and legs. On command, Danny exhaled and pushed, while the team pulled slowly from behind. For a moment, he moved. His legs shifted back a few inches. Then his hips struck the hidden lip again. Pulling harder would not save him. It could break him. The next option was to widen the slot. But the space was almost impossible to work in. Rescuers had to lie in mud, shoulder to shoulder. Only one or two people could reach Danny at a time. There was no chamber, no flat floor, no room for large tools, and nowhere safe for broken rock to fall. So, the The rescue became painfully slow. A strip of clay was removed, then a loose stone, then a small flake from the ceiling. Progress was measured in handfuls. Outside, more rescuers arrived on the wooded slope. Equipment was carried uphill and passed underground. Inside the cave, teams rotated through the crawl, worked until exhausted, then backed out covered in mud. Danny remained conscious for much of the rescue. His face swelled from the tilted position. His trapped arm went numb. His breathing shortened. The cold water under his chest soaked his clothing. The clay around him became firmer as his weight pressed into it. The cave was not crushing him quickly. It was molding around him slowly. By the 9th hour, rescuers had created slightly more space around his legs, but almost none around his torso. Every attempt to rotate him failed. Every pull risked bending him harder across the hidden drop. They kept working at the rock lip above his pelvis. If they removed enough of it, his hips might drop and his body might straighten. For hours, they chipped tiny pieces from the edge. Dust mixed with water and turned to paste. Every few minutes, they stopped to check Danny's breathing and make sure the passage had not shifted. Eventually, they gained a small amount of clearance. The team prepared for another pull. This time, the hidden lip did not hold Danny as tightly. His legs came back several inches. For a brief moment, it seemed like the cave was releasing him. Then the second trap revealed itself. The clay around Danny's chest held firm. His lower body moved backward, but his upper body stayed locked in the trench. The movement bent him at the waist and forced his ribs harder into the mud pocket. Rescuers stopped immediately. They had freed his hips enough to move, but his chest, shoulder, and trapped arm were still sealed below the bend. There was no room to reach him from above. No rescuer could pass beside him. The only working space was still behind him, near his legs. But the small movement had changed one thing. Before, Danny was wedged so tightly that rescuers could barely reach the clay holding his torso. Now that his hips had shifted back, a narrow gap had opened along one side of the trench. It was enough for a rescuer to slide one arm deeper into the passage. They stopped pulling and began removing the mud by hand. Thin strips came loose first. The clay was packed tightly around Danny's ribs and shoulder. Every handful had to be scraped out carefully and passed backward through the crawl. If they removed too much too quickly, loose stones could drop into the gap and trap him harder. So they worked slowly. Clay from beside his chest, clay from beneath his shoulder, small stones from the lower edge of the trench. Danny was weakening, but still conscious. His answers came slower. Sometimes he only moved one foot to show he could still hear them. His breathing was shallow, but each strip of clay gave his chest slightly more room. After nearly another hour, the gap beside his torso was wide enough to try again. This time, they did not pull hard. They pulled slowly while the rescuer closest to Danny kept clearing the muddy side of the trench. As his hips moved back, more trapped clay became reachable. As more clay was removed, his chest had more space to rise. For the first time, his upper body and lower body began moving together. His shoulder scraped against the wall. His trapped arm slipped loose. Then his chest broke free from the mud pocket. The rescuers paused, checked his breathing, and continued inch by inch. Danny could no longer help much, but the cave was no longer holding him in two separate places. His hips cleared the hidden lip. His ribs passed the bend. His helmet light finally reappeared in the slot. After nearly 17 hours underground, Danny Derber was pulled free. He did not stand. Rescuers laid him on the muddy floor and checked his breathing and circulation. His face was swollen, his arm was numb, and his body was shaking from cold and exhaustion. But he was alive. The rescue was not finished. They still had to move him through the crawls, the stream passage, and the broken limestone before reaching the entrance. But the impossible part was over. The cave had trapped him by letting him move forward, then locking him when he tried to return. He survived because that first small movement gave rescuers access to the muddy side holding his chest. Once they removed enough of it, the cave finally released him. On Saturday, May 14th, 2005, a 19-year-old spelunker entered Pretty Green Sink with his party and began the descent towards Swilden's Hole, one of the most famous cave systems in the Mendip Hills. The route was not a casual walk underground. It was a vertical and awkward connection into a deeper system, a place where ropes, water, narrow passages, and judgment all had to work together. One mistake would not simply mean embarrassment. It would mean that the cave itself decided what happened next. The group moved through the entrance with the confidence of people following a known route. The plan was to descend through Pretty Green Sink, pass into Swilden's, and continue through the system. Everything depended on controlled movement. The pitches had to be rigged properly, the rope had to run cleanly, and each caver had to manage their own body while hanging in space beneath the surface. At around 1:30 in the afternoon, the 19-year-old began abseiling through the shaft. The rock around him was close enough to touch, wet in places, and irregular enough that every contact point mattered. His light caught the walls in fragments as he lowered himself, and for a moment, the descent remained ordinary. Then something went wrong. The drop came suddenly. He fell about 20 feet, in open air that would already have been violent. Inside a cave pitch, it became worse because the fall did not end with a clean vertical stop. His body swung across the shaft and slammed into the pitch wall. The impact drove directly into his knee. For a few seconds, there was only shouting, rope movement, and the echo of pain inside the shaft. Then the reality of the injury began to settle. His kneecap had been shattered. He was conscious, but he could not climb, could not crawl properly, and could not be expected to move through the cave under his own strength. The location made everything worse. He was not lying near an easy entrance where rescuers could simply pull him back out. He was suspended inside a connection between systems, below one awkward pitch and above another. Evacuating him back through Pretty Green Sink would be slow, difficult, and dangerous. Every delay would leave him hanging in cold air while the pain and shock built. His companions made the decision that shaped the entire rescue. They lowered him down the next pitch. It sounds wrong at first, almost impossible to justify, because the injured cavers was being taken deeper into the cave instead of upward toward daylight. But underground, the shortest route is not always the safest route. By lowering him into Swilden's 4 streamway, they placed him where the rescue team could reach him faster from the Swilden side. It was a brutal decision, but it saved time. The Mendip Rescue Organization was called at 1:30 p.m. 40 rescue team members became involved. The first rescuers entered the system with splints, medical equipment, ropes, and the knowledge that this evacuation would not be simple. When they reached him, the first priority was stabilizing the leg. A shattered kneecap underground is not just a painful injury, it changes the entire rescue. The casualty cannot brace, cannot help with climbs, cannot absorb jolts, and every movement through tight passage risks sending new pain through the body. The injury was splinted. Then he was lowered down Couch Avon into the Swilden's 4 streamway proper. That was when the rescue reached its strangest and most frightening decision point. There were 2 possible routes out. The first was through Blue Pencil Passage and back through Paradise Regained. The names sound almost playful, but the reality underground was ugly. Blue Pencil was twisting, tight, and awkward. The kind of passage where even an uninjured caver has to fight the rock with shoulders, hips, elbows, and knees. Moving a casualty with a destroyed kneecap through that route would mean hours of grinding progress, repeated pain, and the constant risk of making the injury worse. The second route was through the sumps. Sump 3, Sump 2, Sump 1. Flooded sections of cave. The kind of passage where the ceiling lowers into the water, and the only way forward is to dive beneath the rock. The casualty was not a cave diver. He had some open water experience, but that was not the same thing. Open water gives space, light, and the ability to rise. A sump gives darkness, rock overhead, cold water, and a route that must be followed exactly. If panic starts inside a sump, there is no surface directly above. There is only the guideline, the diver beside you, and the need to keep moving. Still, the sumps became the chosen route. It was the lesser horror. The rescue team understood that forcing him through Blue Pencil could take longer and punish the injury continuously. The sump route was terrifying, but it was more direct. With the cave diving group assisting, and with 4 cave divers watching him closely, the injured caver would be given a crash course in cave diving inside the cave itself. Imagine that moment. He was 19 years old, injured, cold, and in pain. His kneecap had been shattered against a rock wall only hours earlier. He had already been lowered deeper underground while rescue teams worked around him. Now he was being told that the way out was not a crawl, not a stretcher haul, not a rope climb, but a series of underwater passages. There was no dramatic speech. There was only instruction. How to breathe from the regulator, how to keep his mouth sealed, how to follow the diver, how not to fight the water, how not to panic. The cave divers prepared him. They controlled the equipment, checked the route, and positioned themselves so that he would never be alone inside the sump. But there are limits to what preparation can remove. Once his face entered the water, the psychological burden belonged to him. The first sump waited in silence. The water was cold enough to tighten every muscle the moment it touched him. His body wanted to resist. His injured leg could not contribute, and every shift of position pulled at the splint. He had to surrender control to people he had only just met, people whose hands and signals now stood between him and drowning. Then he went under. The world changed instantly. Sound disappeared into pressure and bubbles. Light shrank to torch beams moving through brown-green water. The roof was somewhere above him, close enough to matter, too close to ignore. There was no open surface, no chance to lift his head and breathe if something felt wrong. The only air was in the regulator. The only route was forward. The cave divers moved him with extreme care. Through each sump, his injury had to be protected while his body was guided through the flooded passage. A sudden twist could drive pain through the shattered knee. A dropped regulator could turn the whole rescue into disaster. A moment of panic could trap everyone in a place where panic had no room to unfold safely. Sump 3 passed, then Sump 2. Each flooded section stole more heat and more strength. Between them, the rescuers checked him, steadied him, and prepared him again. The worst part was that every successful passage did not end the ordeal. It only delivered him to the next one. Then came Sump 1. By then, everyone understood how close the rescue was to changing from difficult to catastrophic. The casualty had already endured more than most injured people ever should underground. The divers had to keep him calm through one more underwater section, one more roof passage, one more place where the cave removed the option of hesitation. At 6:45 p.m., he reached the upstream side of Sump 1. He had made it through. The most psychologically dangerous part of the rescue was over, but the cave still had to be exited. From there, movement through the rest of Swaldens was faster, partly because the route was more manageable, and partly because the casualty himself showed remarkable determination. Pain did not disappear, but the possibility of the surface had finally become real. Rescuers moved him steadily through the remaining passages. The cave was still physically demanding. Every climb, every corner, every awkward section required hands on the casualty and careful communication between team members. But compared with the sumps, the remaining cave felt merciful. At 8:40 p.m., he reached the surface. The rescue had lasted 6 hours. The fall had started as a single moment on rope, a 20-foot drop followed by a pendulum into rock. But the injury forced one of the most disturbing rescue choices imaginable. Take a 19-year-old with a shattered kneecap through tight passages for hours, or teach him enough cave diving underground to pass through 3 flooded sumps. The rescuers chose the water, and somehow, with pain, trust, and 4 cave divers guarding every movement, he came out alive.